Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Cultural Communication Confidence with me, Victoria Reynoldson. And I'm incredibly excited to have a guest joining us here today who is an absolute expert in the field of cultural intelligence, somebody who I admire very much, have been connected with and known for many years, and really excited to have as a guest here today. So thank you so much, Ritika Wadhwa, for joining us here today. Thank you for being here and for sharing all your insights with us.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for having me. I've been following you for a while and listening to some episodes of your podcast, and it is an absolute honor and pleasure to be having this conversation with you today.
Amazing. Well, let's get down to it. Really excited to get into some of the conversations we'll be having today. And where I want to start is a question that's on my mind, which is we speak in English. English is seen as the international globalized language of business. That is kind of an assumption that is made. But is this a problem when we think about cultural intelligence, when we think about multicultural working?
Ooh, great question to dive into with, right? So I'm going to break it up into two. First of all, I'm going to ask you and the listener, why is English the communication language for business? Why? Where did that come from? Who decided, and why has it become that way? Whether that's an assumption or a reality, I think we need to prod a little bit further and ask ourselves why we've got to that stage. Of course, we know the answers around history and what colonialism meant for continents, and where we've got to as a world for English to be there. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is that whether that's a problem. That problem is defined by the person who is communicating. Whether that is a problem or not is defined by them. And what I mean by that is that if we look at the CQ framework, the cultural intelligence work, CQ action would be that speech, the language, the verbal, the non-verbal communication, right? So if I am speaking to someone where English is not the first language, how am I adjusting to that? How am I aware of that? How am I communicating in a way that it makes sense for someone that English is not the first language? Equally, I can choose not to adapt. So that's a choice. And then that's when that becomes a problem, perhaps. And from the other end of the spectrum, English is not my first language, but I have endeavored to learn it and speak in it because of the outcome I want from that interaction, or the outcome I want from life, or outcome I want from my career, whatever it is that you want. How am I flexing and adapting, learning English in order to become successful at what I want to become? Again, part of that CQ action.
I
Very
think that
much led both ways.
I think that's such an interesting point, isn't it? Because it's actually not just about the responsibility of one side or the other. Actually, there's a joint responsibility there to take action, to adapt. And I think this is something which is a little bit hidden sometimes, because many of the people who'll be listening would consider themselves fluent in English. Even if it's their second or third or even fourth language, they would consider that they're working in English every day. That's their working language. And in fact, people who have English as their first language might work with people who they think, are very, very fluent. But there are those nuances and miscommunications and those kind of moments when things don't fully flow. So, you talked there about adapting. What does that look like in reality? What's the kind of practical approaches that people can take to think about to make communication perhaps more inclusive?
From a general perspective or from an English perspective?
Well, let's start general and then we can kind of drill down.
Okay. What can people do to make communication more inclusive in general? So I like to step back a little bit at this point and talk about the cultural intelligence framework. And by no means am I an expert. I've learned from the best. But cultural intelligence is the ability to adapt and ability to work with people that are different from us, in a nutshell, in diverse situations, in multicultural situations. Now, it's formed of 4 capabilities, similar to EQ that has 4 capabilities. So CQ, you've got CQ drive, CQ knowledge, CQ strategy, and CQ action. CQ drive is the why. Why should I even be interested in working, or am I even interested in working with people that are different from me? CQ knowledge is the what. How much do I understand about how cultures are similar and different? CQ strategy is how am I using that knowledge to plan for those interactions? And CQ action is the actual behavior. So how do we make communication more inclusive? If we walk through that from that perspective of the 4 capabilities, the why, you've got to be clear about what outcome you want from this communication that you're going to have. So I'm having this communication with Victoria right now. What outcome do I want from it? The listeners to walk away feeling valued and feeling like they have learned something, that their time has been valued. And so that's your CQ drive. So CQ knowledge, what do I know about how Victoria prefers to communicate, based on perhaps the culture you come from, or based on perhaps my knowledge of whether English is your first language or not. Whatever it is that I know about how you like to interact, and then how am I planning, how am I using that knowledge? How am I being aware that actually I made an assumption that because Victoria's second language is English, maybe she's not able to communicate really well with me. But actually, now that I'm talking to you, wow, like you're communicating brilliantly. And so how am I flexing and adapting in that moment based on the assumption I had made is the CQ strategy. How am I walking away from that interaction and asking myself, what could I have done better from this interaction? And the action, the CQ action part is the here and the now. How am I speaking to you? What is my, I'm using my hands. Is that appropriate in this situation? Perhaps not, because I'm trying to mirror you maybe and say I shouldn't use my hands. So, and then the verbal and the non-verbal part, especially when you are in front of each other face to face, how do we flex and adapt? So what inclusive communication looks like, the short answer is it depends, because who are you communicating with, in what context you're communicating, what outcome do you want from that, what is your adaptability and value set for you to be able to want to adapt in the first place. And so you've got to analyze all of that. And most importantly, I think you've got to analyze the stakes. How high are the stakes in that communication or in that interaction for you to really put some work behind it before you get to that place? And if the stakes are not so high, how can you flex and build that muscle of cultural intelligence, very much like driving a car? When you're learning to drive a car, you're very conscious every time you change the gear. Once you've learned, you're just driving, aren't you? You're not thinking about it. And so developing that muscle of cultural intelligence would mean that when you communicate with people that are different from you, it should become almost, I wouldn't say second nature, but not require the effort that it requires up front. So I should be able to use the verbal and non-verbal cues, maybe speak a bit more slowly, depending on who I'm talking to and their level of understanding of the language. Maybe give time to pause and reflect. Maybe understand to some extent, and this is a really important part, when we ask people to speak up, are they comfortable to speak up?
That's a big one, right? Actually, that's a really interesting one. And there's so much I want to sort of unpack from what you've just said. But if I just jump into that right now, inviting people to just unmute and speak up, to say what they think. Why is that such a big challenge from a cultural point of view?
Yeah, great question. So the number of times I've run workshops and sessions where I've had people, mainly managers and bosses, that will say, I have asked my team, or told my team they can challenge me anytime they want. That my office, whether that's virtually or in person, the door is always open subjectively, and you can walk in and challenge me, give me feedback anytime you want. But my team is not giving me that feedback. They're not challenging me, and this is frustrating me because I'm asking them, how am I going to get better if you don't tell me what I'm doing wrong? And so let's just step back for a second there. Who are you dealing with? Cultures has play such a huge part in that simple ask that's frustrating you, because irrespective of which country you were brought up in, I go back to the analogy of when you were little, was it okay for you to challenge your mom and dad or carer on the dinner table? Was it okay for you to challenge and speak up in the classroom? So some of those are ingrained in the way we were brought up, where in a lot of cultures, it's not okay to question authority, that you actually don't even look at them in the eye and speak to them, because respect means you look down and speak when you're speaking to someone older or someone with authority. So when all of that is ingrained in us, you can't just leave it at the door when you come to work and suddenly start speaking up and challenging authority. There's something so innately um, uncomfortable about that. So innately uncomfortable that when you ask people to do that, you're doing it from the lens of what's comfortable from you, what's acceptable and familiar to you. Maybe it's not to them. And so allowing people the space to speak up in a way that it works for them, the platinum rule of cultural intelligence is, I'm going to show you respect, or I'm going to work with you in a way that it works for you, not for me or for generally the world. And so that's the golden or platinum rule for communication and speaking up as well, where it doesn't always have to be about speaking up.
So that's really interesting, because what would that look like as an alternative? Because I can imagine that many people listening are thinking, right, yeah, absolutely. I know what that feels like when you're suddenly invited to unmute and you just don't feel comfortable to do that. So what are the alternatives? What are the options to do that? I think it'd be really helpful also to think about in person, but also perhaps virtually as well.
Correct. Okay. So virtually, some of the options, and I'm not remembering. I think it's Google that has come up with the silent brainstorming. So actually, the agendas are sent out beforehand, and then people are allowed to write it down or send an email before the meeting itself around what their ideas and thoughts might be. And that could be by email or even pieces of paper on the table where people don't write their name on it, and this is what I feel, or these are my point of view, and then that's accumulated in person or then virtually via email. The other thing about it is that if you're virtual, what about the chat function? Always, anything people want to say, you can say it via chat. You can, or if you don't even want to use the chat function, give them the option to say, your thoughts and opinions are really valuable to us. Can you email us separately later? Or if you want a one-to-one conversation with someone in the team, can we have that virtually or in person separately? So there are so many ways to give people the option, but I think giving the option is important rather than my way or the highway, or this is the only way that that I can value your opinion if you do it my way. So all those little things of inclusion, as I say, to go, what about neurodiversity? Have we taken that into consideration? What does that mean for a neurodiverse individual to speak up? Is there other ways? And the world that we operate in right now, communication and the number of ways that we can communicate. And I'm going to close this off with this, where I attended a session even recently, and Lord Jeffrey Archer was actually sharing that when Charles Dickens wrote his books, he had to take that book and physically go from one place to the other and read it. And that was the only mode of communication available as far as marketing was concerned. But now, if we look at when someone launches a book, how many different ways it is to get to the audience, whether that's audio version, whether that's a physical version, book launches, social media, email, like it's just, so there's no excuse anymore, so to speak, in the ways that we can allow people to communicate and speak up.
I love that. And I think it's sort of saying that what you're saying here is that there's such a creativity approach. We can think about all of the possible ways rather than just relying on the ways which are easiest, or perhaps their default ways because they're ways that we've always used, right? So I love that. And I love that sort of comparison to a book launch. I hadn't ever thought of that. How did Charles Dickens ever promote his books? But that is an amazing idea in itself. Fantastic. And I want to move to a slightly different topic, because one of the things that I know you're incredibly active on LinkedIn, and I often see you sort of sharing some really powerful things. And one of the things I heard you or saw you writing about recently, I think in the last few days, was about the India Global Forum. And I'm just really kind of curious about this, again, about perceptions, East-West, about the opportunities and where cultural intelligence comes into that as well.
Oh, this is one of my favorite topics, Victoria. So, So when I launched Prabhaav Global, my organization about a year ago, the vision I had primarily was this, that the world has moved on in a big way. So there was a time when I was growing up in India specifically, where the influence of the West was so big, so big. It still is, but then it was unbelievable because it was almost as if we have to learn English, we have to speak in English. English was the primary language of communication and education in schools. And so the influence was so vast that that there was no other way other than, in order to be successful, we had to mirror the West or learn the ways of the West. In the last few years, it's turned on its head because actually the way geopolitical forces have moved and the world has moved around us, the West needs the East more than ever before. If I just give the example of India, India is the largest democracy in the world. It's slated to be the third largest economy by 2027. And if you look at the workforce, even the largest skilled workforce with an average age of 23 exists in India. It's the tech capital of the world. It's the cultural capital of I say capital, but what I mean by that is that superpower that comes from having access to all of that. And so one of the other things is India is not buying oil from in dollars anymore, right? So what does that mean from where the need is arising? That considering that a country like India is relatively young, and I say young, 75 years of independence from the British rule. And in 75 years, India has taken over, the India GDP has taken over UK's, right? So with all of those forces going on, the prerogative for the West, so the organizations that I'm working with right now are really invested in genuinely learning how to be successful in that culture, which is vastly different. And I can say that from very personal experience where I've spent half my life in India and the other half in the UK. And when you look at those 10 cultural values or behavioral preferences, it's polar opposites for India and the UK. And so far, when I first arrived here in the UK, I was, without knowing it, fitting in to the vastly different cultural values. So I came from a collectivist thinking, and it was individualistic thinking here. I came from a high power distance culture where hierarchy meant everything, to being here where we don't even know who the boss in the room is. So that adjustment went one way. Now it feels like we need to understand what's going on there. And if we are low power distance here in the UK, how should I be flexing and adapting in order for those that are high power distance to be able to speak up?
Wow.
I've hired for diversity. I've hired for unique perspectives. I've hired because I want to globalize. I want to expand. I want to grow as an organization, as a team, as an individual. But in order to do that, in order to really thrive, I'm going to have to learn the ways of the East. I'm going to have to make sure that I get my team that's based in India to speak up in a way that it works for them. That's what I'm doing,
Wow.
working with those organizations.
That's fantastic. And I'm really kind of curious, do you find organizations are open? They're thinking about this and planning ahead and future oriented in that way?
So Victoria, I'll ask you the question back. What's the alternative for those organizations?
Yeah.
If they're not thinking that way, are you going to even be around in 5 years' time? Genuinely, are you? I mean, the number of international law firms I'm working with right now that are expanding in Dubai or expanding in India. Like, if you don't go down, if you don't do this, will you survive, let alone thrive? And so it's that competitive edge, isn't it? I talk about cultural intelligence, building that awareness, learning, investing in it. And I mean, not just monetarily, but time-wise, and building that leadership skill, because really it gives you that competitive edge. If you're not doing it, your suppliers are doing it, your competition is doing it. And so you're left behind trying to muck your way around. The number of organizations that I am also hearing of that are closing offices in India because they're frustrated with the hierarchy. They're frustrated with the bureaucracy. But hang on. So you're used to doing things a certain way. So you're coming from a very task-based culture, and you're trying to work in a relationship-based culture. And I'll give you one example of that, meaning the legal system in India, for example, is not as watertight as the legal system in the UK.
Mhm.
Okay? So when I'm buying a house, or if I am wanting to work with somebody and have a business arrangement with them, that's primarily based on trust and relationship in India. Because guess what, Victoria, I'm going to do a business for 100,000 rupees with you, and I'm going to shake my hands. Tomorrow, if Victoria says, I'm not going to pay you anymore, I could be fighting in the courts for years and years and never get my money. That's not how it works in the UK. You've got a watertight legal system, which is why in the Indian culture, it's relationship based. Now, if you're not going to get your head around that, you're not going to be able to succeed in that culture. If you want to succeed, right? Think of the workforce that you have access to. Think of the technology you have access to. I mean, someone was saying, was it in India is getting rid of all those bureaucracies and hassles that were in the way, because you can see. So there was 9,980 patents signed in India, I think a year or a couple of years ago. And then right now it stands at 100,000.
Wow. That's
Okay. Where are
amazing.
you going to go? Where are you going
Yeah.
to go?
So this is a really interesting question. I mean, you started to touch on this, but what do you see as the biggest mistakes that, say, more Western or Western influenced organizations are making when they try to do things like move into India or try to build in teams to support their central functions? Like, so what do you see as the biggest mistakes that go on?
The biggest mistake is going with the lens of what is acceptable and familiar to me is the right way.
Hmm.
Or this is all I know, so there's got to be this. So, for example, and I'm just thinking aloud here. So for example, when you go into an I had someone, and I'll use this honestly as an example. Someone came up to me a few weeks ago and said, after I'd conducted the session on cultural intelligence, 60-something white man, he said, about 15, 20 years ago, he was sent to Malaysia to train Malaysian women on how to become assertive. I just like,
I'm raising my eyebrows.
right. Okay, right. So, I mean, then
Yeah.
acceptable. But then what is my benchmark? What does assertiveness mean from a dominant culture, from from a Western context? What does an assertiveness mean? What does decision making mean? What does hierarchy mean? What does all of that mean? What is it that I'm used to? And things moving at a certain pace because of the way systems are put in place that way, the business values, the business norms, the society, how all of that works is very different in other cultures. And from that perspective, what is acceptable and familiar to me when I go into a different context? How am I adapting?
Mm.
How am I looking at it from a lens where I'm using that CQ framework? I'm going into this culture, which is vastly different because I want to achieve this from this interaction or this culture. What knowledge do I have about this culture? How much of that is assumption and stereotyping? How am I free to flex and adapt to really get that outcome I want, which is the why? And how am I behaving in that way? So when I'm asking people to speak up, or when I'm looking at hierarchy, when I'm looking at uncertainty avoidance, what does that mean from a risk perspective, where I personally feel okay to take risk, but I'm not giving enough context because I'm okay about that. When I'm working with teams that I'm asking them across borders to do a certain task, and I send them 3 bullet points, they want more context. They come back to me asking for more context. I send 3 more bullet points. They want more context. They come back again. And that's when I start getting frustrated and start going, oh my God, just get on with it. Okay. And then mistrust comes in, and then
Yeah.
it starts falling apart.
And I see this, and I also, hear these examples. I see people talking about this as well. So obviously cultural intelligence training that you do, that I do, that helps, of course. And I love the way you describe it as, it's almost like learning to drive a car. You have to build up that muscle memory so that it becomes automatic for you. Is there anything else specific that you'd really want people to focus on? Obviously, they can take the training, but is there something particular that you think makes that massive difference between succeeding and the frustrations, the miscommunications, the breakdown in the relationships?
So even using the car example, someone I respect a lot, when I shared this example with them, they said, okay, so you know how to drive. Then they challenged me beautifully. They said, you know how to drive the car really well, to the point where you're driving and you're not even realizing that you're changing the gears. Okay, so what happens when you move to or go and drive in a country where you've got to drive the opposite side of the road, right?
Yeah.
So then you're relearning, or you're getting
Mm.
your brain to recalibrate to what is required at that moment. That's the same with cultural intelligence. You can never get to the point where your muscle is so perfectly built that you don't need to upkeep it or actually change the way you do certain things in order to maintain or grow, continue to grow. So, in terms of learning, of course, workshops, etc. But for me, one of the most important parts of the cultural intelligence work is that why. The CQ drive is just like I can't put enough focus on it, because it's so hard to be persistent on this journey if you're not clear. Whether that's the overall why, that I'm genuinely curious to work with people that are different from me, or actually I'm not curious at all. And so why is that? Why do I need to develop that curiosity? And in life we'll go through peaks and troughs where sometimes you're really curious and you enjoy those the hard work that comes with working with people that are different from you, or interacting with people that are different from you. And sometimes it's really easy depending on which life cycle you're at, where your work's at, where your life is at. So the first most important thing I always recommend is dig deep into your why, the overall why, but also for every interaction that you feel might be uncomfortable, let's dig deeper onto why, what you want to get out of that interaction. What outcome do you want? What impact you want to have from that interaction? And once you're clear about your why, it's easier to follow the rest of the steps. But equally, part of that learning and growing and changing gears and learning to drive on the other side of the road is the experience and reflection. So if your why is really strong, how can I deliberately put myself in situations that I experience the unfamiliarity, whether that's eating at a restaurant, local restaurant filled with the locals, riding in the local transport, talking with someone who has vastly different views from you, following 5 people on LinkedIn or social media that you would never consider, or that just have some such vastly different opinions from the way you lead your life. The books that you read that you might go, oh my God, that is really uncomfortable to read, or podcasts that you would listen to that feels very uncomfortable. Immerse yourself in those experiences and then walk away from it and ask yourself, what about that made me feel uncomfortable?
Yeah, I
I think
love that. I
the
really love
biggest
that.
learning has to be the biggest learning of growth within the cultural space has to be experience and reflection.
Mm.
But equally, if I step back from that for 1 second to close this answer, is to say you will not want to experience and reflect unless you unpack your why.
That's brilliant. And I love the fact that it starts with that. Like, we have to understand our motivation or lack of motivation. I think there's an honesty piece here, isn't there, around genuinely what is the motivation. And I think those are some really practical ways as well that you've just shared, that people can really start to develop the muscles, develop that kind of sense of moving into spaces which aren't always in the comfort zone. This is fantastic, Ritika. And my sort of final question really is, what would you love the world to look like in 10 years' time? Where do you see, you have your vision for what the work that you do, but what would you love the world to look like in 10 years' time?
Oh,
As a big question to end on.
right. Well, really, I mean, this is genuinely why I'm doing what I'm doing, is really for people to just be whoever they want to be. And if they're not, and I don't mean whoever they want to be at the cost of anything, but really, if I'm who I love, who I marry, my ability, the religion I want to follow, the clothes I want to wear, I don't think anyone should have the right to decide if it's personal happiness that is not affecting someone else's personal space or happiness. And so I think just how can we, and that's like utopia, isn't it? It's utopia. But really, if you then step back from that, just people to be able to talk about it. Right now, the world feels so polarized, so completely polarized, that my way is this way and your way is that way, whether there's only one way to get to heaven, one way to achieve, one way to connect with God. And that's all there is. Actually, there isn't. And so, or then even where we are at with politics, the polarization that exists in the world right now, for people to just be able to come to the table with an open mind and have a conversation, genuinely come from a place of curiosity. If we can start from that right now, I think in 10 years' time, we'll be living in a very different world, a world that is so much better and easier for the generations coming behind us. And so, coming from that place of curiosity rather than judgment, having an open mind, and the conversations that come from that, the decisions that are made from that, the interactions that come and the connections that come from that is what will see the world in 10 years' time in a way that it works for someone like me. And that's why we do what we do.
Amazing. Thank you. That has been such a great end to this particular podcast. Ritika, if people want to find out more about you, your work with cultural intelligence, how you support organizations, where are the best places for people to really find out more?
We're all over the place, right? We're everywhere. But the website, I'm on LinkedIn, so please connect. We're on Instagram, connect there. Email contact@prabhaav-global.com. But yeah, so many ways to connect, and look forward to seeing those connections. But really thankful for the platform that you provided today, Victoria, and having me for this very important conversation with great leading questions.
Well, thank you so much, Ritika, for generously sharing so many rich ideas here today. I know the listeners will be taking away some really powerful strategies, some thought-provoking starting points, and it really are starting points on the journey. So, I really am very grateful to you for joining us here today. So thank you so much for being here. And yes, I will put all the links to your various websites and so on in the show notes for everybody to follow up with you. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening today, and look forward to seeing everybody next time on Cultural Communication Confidence.